It's a pleasure to be here. I am from California, where we're burning up, and we are here to discuss the re-envisioning of urban landscapes. I'm Victoria Vesna. I direct the UCLA Art Science Center, and this program is actually centered at the UCLA Botanical Gardens. So we're very honored to have had the whole festival opened by Dr. Victoria Sork, who until recently was the Dean of Life Sciences and was at the same time a full-on researcher dealing with genetics and oak trees, and also working as the director of the Botanical Gardens, really thinking through how to make it more open. And we have been discussing how to bring in artists into the garden. So Alvaro Azcaraga, buenos dias. He's a graduate student at UCLA Design Media Arts, and he will actually have his thesis based in the Botanical Gardens. So I asked him to be a kind of a moderator, which pushes the edge, but it's important to take on the lead in that respect. And then we have guests from the East Coast, Petya Morozov and Matthew Friday, who prefer to call themselves SPURSE. SPURSE is a large group or small group, we don't know. They're a dispersed group of researchers, creatives, scientists, thinking about our environment in ways that actually make a difference. And we love working with SPURSE. So it's a longer relationship now, I must say, and I'm really happy to see you guys here. And finally, Ariel Simons, who also has been coming along to the Art Science Center quite a bit and is doing some pretty amazing work with light pollution. He just gave a lecture about that, and thinking about the environment in relation to light. So we'll start with Victoria Sork giving us a little bit of a contextual background of the botanical gardens, to see how it grew from where it was to where it is and where it's going. And welcome and thank you. So you can share the screen and we can get
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. And, given the panel is really talking about how humans want to transform landscapes and what we can do with them and say with them, I thought, and being that we're such the proud partners in this location for this event, I thought I'd just give you a little bit of history and talk about it in the context of landscape change. And before I, there we go. All right. So the fact that I have a big title does not mean I will go on too long. But this is the Botanical Garden at UCLA as we see it today. Very large, lots of large trees from all over the world, and a good emphasis on both California and also subtropical areas. But it wasn't always a botanical garden that looked like this. In fact, this garden, which now has such tall trees, it's hard to realize that just a short time ago, it looked like this. UCLA was built in 1929, and here you see all these plants that were planted out to test how different species could do in landscapes, really people's backyards and horticultural plantings. So this is how it started. There was a Department of Botany, and this site, which is Arroyo, it actually at one point went along the whole side of campus, but it gradually was shrunk from that size to a smaller area, so that in the 60s, it started becoming more of a botanical garden instead of an experimental garden, where it's to illustrate the plants of the world for teaching, for aesthetics, and be kind of an area of respite for the campus. And now you see it today, how much bigger and lusher those trees have gotten. So we went from the 1930s to where it wasn't even have any of these species to 75, 80 years later, and they're really very tall. And if anything, we have to keep pruning, we have to create openings. So if we want to create new micro habitats for plants to grow, we have to grow it. In fact, we try to curate our collections very specifically, and this is just a map of the garden, and I just want to point out that each of the areas we have identified, this says ancient forest, this is the desert garden, this is the subtropical woodland, another subtropical woodland. We even have a Hawaii section. But the point is, the whole garden is really a set of gardens where we're trying to tell a story. So we want it to be aesthetically pleasing, but we also want to make it useful for teaching, for research. This is a source of putting in for species where you want genetic material. And this is a very dramatic example of how you can go from a landscape that, if we were never to have disturbed it, would have been a chaparral. So a chaparral along the ridges, you would have had, lots of sage. You would have a lemonade berry growing there. In the stream that ran through this arroyo, there would have been coast live oak growing and growing quite big. So it went from being a native chaparral area into this very managed, deliberate ecosystem for its own mission. So with that, I just wanted to welcome you to the garden and look forward to the comments about urbanized landscapes that the other panel members are going to speak to.
Okay. Thank you so much, and thank you for hosting us. It's been quite wonderful, actually, learning more, and from your team as well, and all the Jules and Terry were also quite wonderful to help out. So let's get started. Alvaro, it's all yours.
Sure. Dr. Sork, for those wonderful pictures. I just came to really work with that garden so like hands-on, and it became just like another home for me. And so thank you for the invitation to participate in the garden. And I think where I want to start off is just this concept of definitions, and like how definitions are changing in today's climate, and how this concept of like what is natural and what is man-made, and like this division between the natural and man-made, I feel like it's at the core of multiple of our issues regarding climate change and regarding the oppression of Black, Indigenous people of color, and how these definitions exclude certain groups of people. So I think where I wanted to start off is just how do we progress with this, like altering the definition of what the natural world means, and like maybe like what does it mean for you? I don't know if anyone wants to start off, but yeah.
Petia, you start.
Mm-hmm. Alvaro, I think I was in sync with you, just trying to see how we can unpack even just the paradigms that we might be coming with, because as you're implying that these are not universal terms, and it's wonderful to give space to us to kind of give our own nuance to it, and maybe in some cases completely depart from our known paradigms of what we think of as nature. I also wanted to put out a question to everybody. What is urban? So while we're sort of tangling ourselves with nature, I feel like perhaps maybe even just trying to think what urban is might get at what we mean by nature and culture. I think SPURSE, and I'm joined here with my colleague Matthew Friday. We're on the East Coast too, so I should say as a precursor that we might have a little bit of a bias, but we are coming from a highly forested, highly historically co-created landscape dating prior to 1491. So I think we've come to terms with some degree understanding that there's this very long legacy of co-created landscapes. And I think that for us, it actually, in order to be able to even understand and appreciate and then work inside of what it means to co-create and be shaping and being shaped by things, I think we made like an elaborate departure in a recent cookbook that we wrote called Eat Your Sidewalk, to help us understand how we depart is maybe through the act of eating. That was sort of our radical tool. And when you realize that landscapes are productive for human and non-human survival and generation, I think you realize that it starts to reframe all of the assumptions around nature. I think I'm sort of dancing with it, not necessarily trying to come up with an accurate term for this discussion, because I want to keep it open, and it's more like a salad. But I do feel like with the way in which Dr. Sork, you pulled us through this recent history, it would be very interesting to also see what other patterns there might have been in the way the landscape was previously shaped, even maybe to go as far as to ask, was that arroyo perhaps shaped for some kind of production? Because I think that, we also look at rivers and water bodies as if they were there for existence. There are so many forces that are shaping them here on the East Coast. We have many examples of maricultural co-construction of water bodies. So I put everything out there. Maybe Matthew, you might chime in on that. But
Sure.
I would love to also maybe circling back, just see how we can unpack urban.
Yeah, I mean, I would just follow up what Petya said, that, and maybe be sort of polemical here and say that I think we just need to throw out the term nature, and I think it's got so much baggage with it. I mean, first of all, that we should understand that the concept of nature is really indigenous and unique to the West, and it's also of pretty recent provenance as a category of the world. And anthropologists like Philip Discola haven't been able to find any corresponding concepts in non-Western culture. It's just the idea of nature simply doesn't exist in most non-Western cultures, especially when we think of in Western culture how it's positioned as in binary opposition to culture, right? And human practices that are understood to be sort of like totally distinct and separate from nature. And so I think we need to use other terms that are more inclusive and allow us to think broader in terms of systems. So like we prefer the term ecosystem, with the understanding that we're always already of an ecosystem, no matter where we are. Like in my dismal little cave here where I do my Zooms so my daughter doesn't bother me, like this is a thriving ecosystem. And if we start from that proposition that we're always in an ecosystem, then we need to start to think about what are the other beings that show up, how are we working with them? How are we listening with them? And I think then that becomes one of the critical questions of urbanism, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, I that's been kind of my experience. So just throwing it out here, like I have an interest in urban ecology, and I'm a postdoc at UCLA. That's one of the things I'm working on. And to me, yeah, that delineation saying like, oh, this is nature, this is not, is kind of useless. And then the more you get into looking at human history, I think maybe the idea of how heavily managed a landscape is, and it's really a matter of degree, and that's probably as good as you're going to get. So you have landscapes that are very much like humans just don't do much with it, but then you have ecosystems that are very human moderated, even if they don't necessarily look built. And so for example, actually I'll throw out the book 1491, which I'm sure a bunch of you probably read, but this idea that when the Europeans got here, very quickly, the indigenous population imploded. And so a lot of, when Europeans moved in, they would see these landscapes and they thought like, wow, this is a total Garden of Eden. This is totally like nature pristine. And it's like, well, no, these are actually really heavily managed landscapes. And perversely, actually, one of the reasons why European civilization sort of just exploded so rapidly across the Americas is that everything was almost just primed for it because other people were managing it for so long, and then that civilization essentially just vanished overnight. You know, it would be like if somehow 90% of all of, you know, US civilization just vanished and some other civilization came in and went like, wow, Kansas is this amazing place for farming. It's like, yeah, because people were spending hundreds of years getting it to that point. So I think it's more of just like how heavily manages it, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's it's heavily built, but I think it's more of just like how many of these ecological arrows are pointing to and away from human beings at any given time. It's probably like the least hand wavy, but probably most inclusive way to talk about this.
Yeah, and there's this role of it's very prevalent in California right now. Just the whole concept of like fire and how we manage our forests is being brought up into conversation, and how involvement from indigenous communities and these cultural burnings of man and forest management have been done for like years and years and generations, and then like was completely banned from the forest services. And how right now there's a lot of California legislature that's pushing for these cultural burnings becoming more of a having more of a presence in California, and having a, like looking back to indigenous communities and how to manage these forests. And I just feel like it's an essential question on how we approach the vision of like the nature, the natural, which we again doesn't exist. Yeah, I don't know where I can ask a question about this, but I was going. Sorry.
Well, I mean, I'm just going to riff on maybe a couple of points. We're going free form, right? So, but I was thinking that as you were talking about managed landscapes and how, you know, how that the recent practices to diminish those more ancient practices got me thinking about how, from a Western, non-Western perspective, you might even say just like how do we have to not just manage landscapes, but then at some point measure them. And I think the moment you start to measure a landscape and not just manage it or not just sense it, I think you cross a line when you start to talk about the measurability of something or the ways in which you identify it. I think that's the reason why when you're eating something, you're sensing where it came from, how it might be harming you, how it might be helping you or some other co-inhabitant of an ecosystem. And so I think the sensing of landscape, the management of landscape are all sort of within, I would say, a non-binary paradigm of landscape. But then the moment you go into measurability, it does feel like we've instantaneously tried to find quantitative approaches to even just the wildfires that we're looking at now. There's probably all sorts of modeling tactics to see how something is going to spread and create, maybe over 5 years' time, some other new ecosystem. And, I'd be curious to hear, Dr. Sork, since that is, part of your practice, like, how do you ever feel you're hitting that sort of threshold? Hello. That you're ever hitting that threshold where you feel like it's not the most helpful or even the most relevant to move into how the performance of a landscape is going, as opposed to the kind of the dynamics of it over time.
I see your comments elicit a lot of response in me, which is that I'll answer the first question, which is the change used to be, let's count how many species that are there, let's maximize diversity. How do we manage a landscape? What is it we're trying to manage it for? And it's gone from, why don't we manage it for the processes and not for the species themselves? So you can decide, for instance, how often you're going to cut a landscape if you're managing it for forestry. You can decide how you want to manage it in terms of stages of succession. We talked about ecosystems. Well, they're not constant over time. So every time an area gets burned, you're setting it back to an earlier stage. If you burn it really hot and you burn it really big, you're going to prevent either species from generating or species from iterating it again. So I think I always worry, maybe I worry because when I initially became an ecologist and evolutionary biologist, I was so static, and what I saw is what I thought was there. And the more I've gotten into understanding history, the more I just realize how nature, and I will say nature and comment on that, how nature is this constant process. I'm going to footnote this comment about nature. I think humans need that word, and why Alvaro was stumbling over what do we find as an alternative, because we have dichotomized ourselves. The cultures that don't distinguish their value versus plants and the ecosystem, they don't need the word because they're so integrated into it. But you really made it in just pointing that out, that nature is a construct, is quite true. But how I distinguish between why do I want to talk about natural processes and talk about nature is I'm very interested in letting what happens when we're not trying to manage it completely, down to everything and predict everything. Whereas what if we manage it to allow processes to take place? Then that's a different framework for thinking about, the ecosystems around us. Same thing could be true as you think about urban landscapes. What are we trying to create? Are we trying to create systems where they can regenerate and evolve and change? Or are we trying to do is say, no, we want to keep it at a certain thing, so we constantly prune, remove, add species to keep it static? And natural processes, including humans, are never static, in terms of changes. And the ecosystem is constantly this. And I don't know how we think about that, and we have to think about that in urban landscapes. But when we put in buildings and we put in people who manage it or trash it or enhance it, do we do it for a static look, or do we do it for a certain kind of process we want to go on, include the other species on this planet besides humans?
Yeah, that's such a good way of putting it. And I think that's the fundamental question of urbanism, right? Is, who gets counted, what gets counted as a citizen? And I mean that in like the broadest sense of like who can participate as an agent, and then how are they activated, and how are they consulted? I think one of the things that really rigorous critical urbanism can do is to sort of introduce this question, and not assume that this sort of system and collaboration of peoples is a purely human enterprise, right? And that when we adopt the position that the only agents that, as you were saying, Victoria, the only agents that are sort of responsible for management of an ecosystem are humans, then we're sort of, we often reduce our understanding of nature to questions of ownership and resources and distribution of resources. And that seems to reinstate a lot of these sort of spurious divisions that, rather than producing any sort of, active and experimental forms of politics and transformation and resilient ecosystems, it ends up just policing a sort of static vision of an ecosystem. And that's a question that SPURSE and, Petty and I and the other folks involved in SPURSE have been really interested in, is like, so what are the techniques and the tools that you use to consult ecosystems? And how do you bring them into the collaborative process in terms of designing an urban environment?
How do you can you give an example?
I'm so glad you asked. Can I share my screen? Is that okay? Because I could show you the picture one here. Let's see.
I got to share. You get to share.
Thanks. I'm gonna just flip this over to full screen in a second here. Can you all see this?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And is it full screen now?
Yes.
So yeah, as Petty was saying, we got inspired, gosh, I guess it's been like 10 years ago. I was gonna say a few years ago, but it's really a while ago, by sort of what was a research field trip up to Alaska to collaborate with First Nations Inupiat people who are practicing subsistence hunting and foraging. And we were just really interested, or like, what are some of the, the practices and processes and histories that they have in terms of engaging their ecology. And that led to a multi-year research project that resulted in this sort of quirky travelogue cookbook work of anthropology and philosophy called Eat Your Sidewalk. And a big part of that research was this incredibly generous invitation we got from Pittsburgh College, which is right outside of Los Angeles, where we were invited for a multi-year gig as their artist, designer, scientists, and residents for a Andrew Mellon funded art and science residency. And so we did a large collaborative project with the students to look at what was already present in their campus. And it's on a big alluvial fan, next to mountains there. It's a desert ecology, a lot of chaparrals, very similar to what you were showing. We were able, and they were already, I don't think we can take entire credit for this, but they're already moving in this direction, but we were able to collaborate with them as they move towards a sort of radical xeriscaping model. So like a lot of colleges, they thought the way you have a college and get wealthy donors and students to come is to make it look like, Yale or something with these managed green grasses. So we got them to dig up all of that and to stop, spraying Roundup and everything. And then to design this massive water catchment system. So the 37-acre campus is on a slight slope. So it slopes down into this one area that catches and preserves the water because, of course, being in California, it rains so rarely. But when it does rain, it rains a lot. So we have to have capture systems. And we were able to create a number of field signages based on the vernacular of state parks. And refer to these as sort of multi-species negotiation centers. I'll just flip through these really quickly. A lot of it was using reclaimed materials, sycamore trees that had been cut recently, debris from a dorm that had pre-existed there. And then there's a map and a website that guides people to the different ecozones. And the website allows you to identify the edible, medicinal, and useful plants and communicate with the other people. So the idea being that it would turn the entire 37-acre campus into this giant food forest. And as Petty was saying, for us, that became a really critical tool in instigating this conversation around how do we become of a place? How do we become interdependent with other species rather than just trying to set aside spaces where they're preserved? And we looked at indigenous practices of water storage. So these are olas. These are extremely large clay, porous clay bodies that are then buried in the earth. So when there's a massive water downfall, they catch and preserve these, and they go from 5 to 10 gallons. And then there's plantings that would go around them in circular patterns. And then there was just a lot of signage around the campus that asked people to move outside of the nature culture mindset. And these served as little, little aphoristic bombs to get people to keep thinking about the land that's under their feet as something more than, an aesthetic landscape. So I'll just stop there. Just as there's certainly more, but that's I think plenty to share with you.
That's lovely. I actually heard about you being there, and Ian came over and had a wonderful workshop. Victoria, Ian Kerr is one of the SPURSE members. Anyway, he led a group of my students through campus to pick edible weeds and We went to back of buildings, where there would be no pesticides, etc., and made a very hot cuisine kind of dinner for everybody with a discussion, and the students just absolutely adored it. It was really great and completely transformed for me how I looked and walked through campus from that point on. And a lot of it I find very upsetting. There's maybe to stir the conversation in that direction. There's still swaths of green grass on our campus, and one that particularly bothers me is right next to the Richard Serra that literally serves no purpose whatsoever. And because I look down at it from the Broad Arts, I always wonder how much water, fertilizer, human labor does it take to just keep this thing green, and nobody does anything with it. It's just a purely strange apparition in this place, and it could be a beautiful garden because it's really a nice piece of patch of land. So any idea of how and why in a institution that's a high level research institution that kind of unconscious behavior with the environment is happening?
Well, it's kind of it's just this inertia. Like, so I mean, I grew up. So growing up in the Midwest, like I always remember this seeing lawns everywhere, and I always just thought like the amount of effort it took to keep a lawn going just seemed like a complete waste to me because I never would ever see people use them anyway.
Yeah.
And I think it's just one of those. So I mean, human beings, I think, have this tendency, like if we can control it, a lot of times we will, if we can get away with it. And I think more that, really in the last couple hundred years, we have almost this godlike power now compared to pretty much any other time in our history as a species, just to extract energy and just to use it. Like the kind of stuff that we can do now as a species really in the last 150 years would just blow anything out of the water, anything we've ever done before that. But it also means that we can do things as an afterthought that are just really inane. Like just having like, I'm just going to throw all this resources to making this one plant and it'll just grow here. And I'm never going to think about it just because I can get away with it. Whereas, if you have to contend more day to day with the cost of doing things, it's almost like, if you, think about the people the Tongva that lived here, like you had to contend more with, okay, every year or so, you're going to have to deal with these fires. You have to factor that in. Like you're not going to redirect the Colorado to have a golf course in the middle of here. And so you have to contend with it. And so it's not like any sort of, there was no initial enlightenment behind why people managed landscapes the way they did here for thousands of years. It was just, there was more of, the cost was high enough that you had to, otherwise you were just going to die. Like any civilization that was not going to like listen to that signal would just implode. Like that's end of story. It's just that only recently, and really since we could on a mass scale tap what is in essence fossilized sunlight, so hydrocarbons, that we can sort of just bypass that and just do like just bizarre things like that. I mean, I'm absolutely convinced that in 500 years, archaeologists are going to come across the ruins of Phoenix and wonder what were they thinking? Why would they do this?
Do you think it'll take 500 years?
Well, I mean, like I just want to give a good margin of error. I mean, the only sad thing is there won't be anything as cool as like the giant heads on Easter Island. It'll it'll just be like one story high but 100 miles wide. And it'll be like, why would you ever do this in the desert? That'll be our great legacy. I guess Las Vegas will probably be more of the showy ruins for future civilizations because that'll be it'll be a complete mystery. But again, like Las Vegas, here are the things you can do. If you can completely wall off an entire river system and then run a generator off of it and plug this in and you just make this like bizarre shrine in the middle of the desert. These are things we can do now as a species, and so we'll do it. And so like having these lawns in the middle of nowhere that nobody uses is kind of a microcosm of it. It's like literally just, it's almost just the exhaust of like, we have this much energy, we have this much power, we have the technology to do this, so we just don't even care anymore. We can.
Let me take a given. It feeds into humans' desire to control their environment, and which is you're saying humans have just gotten out of control. But the way in which we want to control it, when people came over from, let's say, England, there were lawns everywhere. They grew naturally. There's lots and lots of rainfall there. So what they wanted to do is they wanted to bring the trees from England, the ecosystems from England, and make their home here just like England. And it's funny because many, many years ago, I was a speaker in South Africa and teaching, and they asked me, I was on exchange, and it was part of a positive way to respond to apartheid was, instead of just cut off things, was to bring intellectual resources to Black people in Africa. So I taught for a month at a Black university, and I said to the professor, what would you like me to teach? And he said, well, I'd like you to talk about community ecology and succession. And I go, oh, that's great. You know, I've given lots of lectures. Now, I've studied succession in the tropics. I've studied succession in the Midwest, and observed in California. So, and I've read all the books. I mean, you know, that's part of my training, was to understand succession. So I go to South Africa, and it's just a fascinating place to look at succession, because the fynbos, which is one of the most diverse ecosystems in the world, and it has all of these plants all intertwined. They don't get that big, but it's really compact. And just an example that the way in which succession works there is you keep having the environment change and new species come up. Well, the professor, his lectures were all taken from he was British trained, and that I was standing in for. He was British background, South African, went to Britain to learn his ecology. So his entire lectures on succession were based on the examples from Britain and had nothing to do with the environment of South Africa. Because so if you only study succession in the UK, you get a very different theory of what succession happens. And I had also spent time in the tropics, so I was much more familiar with this mosaic of landscapes changing. So I inserted into the lecture, well, first of all, I gave the example of the traditional view of succession, and I took out all the European names of who did the studies. Why would a group of Black South Africans care about British scholars that came up with this theory? So I left their names out. Then I went out on weekends. I would go see the local ecosystem, and I went to the fynbos, and I'm like, I can't talk about succession in the UK. So I talked about succession in the fynbos and compared it to succession in the tropics, completely out of the textbook. And the professor got very, very upset with me, partly because I left out the names of scientists, but partly because I had changed the lecture. And my point here is there's a lot of tradition of humans wanting to teach what we learned and where we learned it from, and then invoke our note. That was their notion of nature. And they want the South Africans to know about succession in England. And very, very good example of you're saying about wanting to control things. But the reason to control it is the way you're used to. So let's make all of North America look like England, right? You can't grow grass in Arizona, it isn't Britain with their nonstop rain. Yeah.
I might get my dates wrong, or my history of Expos wrong, but World Expos function in large part to be able to bring a more universal, modern idea of what progress is, and especially in urban environments, and at least from the perspective of architecture and urbanism, those were hugely important tools that globalized concepts of what it is to be civilized. And so and then I'm thinking about the as you were describing earlier, Victoria, the how botanical gardens have evolved to be ways to sort of sample different parts of the world. I feel there's a really strong likeness in those two examples to try and introduce what ecosystems might be like halfway around the world. And the amount of responsibility that comes with that is immense. And just to be able to also create a reasonable answer to people who constantly ask, well, how can I get rid of invasive species? When we have been migrating species of all kinds for a very long time, and it's not a Western idea. I mean, we've Westernized it, but it is definitely not a Western idea. It's not even a human idea. I mean, it is not a construct, and so it's such a, I was just trying to find a lead into how we might be able to talk about this in the context of other language that is very problematic about invasive species and native species, and how there are these heavy conservation efforts behind these notions, and it's both fascinating and very troubling to see how people are completely unable to see how deeply shaped they are by certain paradigms, to the point that they don't, it can't escape their imagination. So I don't know. What would be your answer, Dr. Sork, to that, to the people who want to suppress natural succession?
Yeah. I'll give you the nice academic answer of on one hand and on the other. So because my own research studies, endemic species, genetic structure, and one of the things that privileges we have in North America that the Europeans don't have is that the manipulation of nature, sorry to go back to that term, Matthew, because you've now made me more sensitive to it. The manipulation of non-human species that are endemic has been much, much less. And even the way native peoples have managed the ecosystems, you have to realize there's been an imprint. They haven't manipulated and created plantations and completely controlled, like the way, when I go to Europe, I'm just so astounded with the difference in how carefully curated that whole, because humans have been there for thousands of years, right? Not thousands, tens of thousands of years. So it's been done much less. So I like the fact that I can kind of study what are the processes of interactions between microorganisms and disease and predators and humans who are at a level that they're part of that ecosystem, see what it looks like. When you start bringing in, because we can bring things in that don't even have, the local species don't even have a chance to respond to. You bring in a Phytophthora from Europe, or you bring in a beetle, when we transport things at a much more rapid rate, that's what I consider an invasive species. And when those invasive species start displacing and manipulating the environment, I have this sort of purist disappointment. And so on the other hand, we can't sit back and not understand that is part of the process that we're now doing. And this goes back to, I really would like to think of whether we're talking about urban landscapes or more wild landscapes. I really would like us to have a process that allows all of those interactions to take place. And so I'm not as completely as, like for instance, like when people do landscaping, I think it's okay to do both native California species and Mediterranean species that can help do well here. So, in our gardens, that it's probably okay to do a mix. And I know some people, in my own research, I'm actually looking at genetics because I'm trying to see of how can we look at to restore and manage ecosystems that we want. How do we mitigate the effects of climate change by introducing new genetic stock? There's some conservation biologists that would be appalled that I would say, let's disrupt the genetic processes. On the other hand, climate change and all the invasive species have already jeopardized these populations. So we're constantly playing off, well, you know, everything's managed. How do you want to manage it?
Yeah, this gets in like this idea of, I mean, in ecology about the difference between function and the, you know, function species. A lot of times you may have a species that's been introduced, but if it has the same ecological function, maybe that's just good enough. And the bigger concern long term is, are the ecosystems we have, are they resilient? And I'm going to say that with like a 20 asterisks next to it, because there's like a lot of different ways to define resilience. But, you know, even though a lot of we've been bringing in stuff from all over the world to everywhere at this point, I mean, this is not new because of humans, but humans have is probably better than almost any other species, can just swap huge chunks of genetic material across the planet. And are the ecosystems that we are now rearranging, are they becoming less resilient or more resilient? And that is, as you get these big shifts in climate, are we building ecosystems or, you know, pushing ecosystems in a way that they're much more likely to collapse just given any sort of slight tap? Or is that actually not changing? Is essentially, are we just rearranging everything, but it's only like a surface level thing where, yeah, like all the names change, but they're sort of their job titles, their ecological job titles, so to speak, didn't change. I mean, I kind of want to, I mean, as in a really extreme example that, you know, it's the case of Ascension Island in the South Atlantic, which is always to me like just like this really interesting story. You know, this volcanic island that was mostly, you know, was very sparsely vegetated. The British got it in the early 19th century because why not? It's a spot on the map. And they were using as this refueling station, except, you know, they had to bring in everything because there was almost no way to retain any groundwater. It was just volcanic soil. Rain would come in periodically and just like soak right through. And Darwin and Hooker of Kew Gardens noted, well, there's always this fog that would roll over every morning. And the idea would be, well, what if we just took every species that we could find that could possibly withstand these, you know, sort of harsh soils that would last long enough to start capturing the fog and condense it. And then in doing so, you start jump-starting and building the soil to plant other things and other things and other things. And so this is like one of those things where, again, in the 19th century, like, you know, nobody cares. So you're essentially, you're just bringing in everything from everywhere. You know, you want to talk about an extreme case of like nothing's indigenous. But they, in essence, over decades in Ascension Island, bootstrapped a cloud forest. And that's always just this really interesting parable to me of like, well, functionally, I guess it works. I mean, it's so far from whatever would have ever happened otherwise. And it's almost just like, I'm trying to remember like who the quote was like, you know, only the English would ever think of like doing something that's like just almost borderline insane. But they did it. And it's just this thing of, you go to Ascension Island, you have this cloud forest now. And it's this complete mess of everything from everywhere. But somehow it works. And I think that's sort of this hopeful story, maybe about in the long run about humanity. Like, you know, even thinking about this with cities, like you just bring in everything from everywhere and somehow it'll work. It may not be pretty, it may not be anything even close to what anybody would call pure, but somehow it persists and it functions.
I think that's a fascinating idea, is thinking about, is that approach to thinking about urban landscapes. I want to go back to this urban and figuring out how do we create ecosystems in cities, because creating ecosystems in cities is not going to be, you know, my pure version of what we want when we have ecosystems that aren't completely surrounded by buildings and highways and at that density. And you all have thought about it more. I wonder if anyone could tell me more about how you think about is ecosystems within cities another way of talking about urbanized landscapes?
Yeah, I think that's such a great question. And I think the first, you know, like a starting point for it would be to first not think of cities as failed ecologies, which is the way we typically think of them, right? Where it's like the people that live in cities hardly think of them as a thriving ecosystem. and they turn towards, you know, in terms of sourcing their food or even their sort of pleasure in walking in so-called natural environments, they look to places outside the city. And so I think a first step is to say a city isn't a failed ecosystem, it's a thriving ecosystem. And so to look at what actually is thriving, what sort of, you know, complex multi-species interdependencies exist within systems, and then how do we like design with those in mind, right? Rather than to come in and say we need to eradicate the rats and the purslane and, you know, the knotweed that's growing everywhere because whatever, it's invasive or something else, but to say like how could we work in cahoots with those, you know, those various you know, those various systems. How can we design with them in mind and catalyze further growth? And I think, Ariel, you bring up such a good point, like that there's always multiple iterative states in the system, and it never has a sort of stable state or some sort of final outcome, that this is a beginning start. Like, so imagine if, like, you know, we look at what Japanese knotweed is doing, which it comes from the volcanic, you know, highlands of Japan. But so it loves asphalt, like that's its natural habitat. Like it thrives, and it's so good at destroying asphalt. And I believe, if I remember correctly, Petya could probably correct me if I'm wrong here, but like in England, you have to, like, you can't have knotweed. You'll be fined for having Japanese knotweed on your property, and you can't sell your property if there's Japanese knotweed on it. It's considered that much of a problem. And I mean, we have it all over in New York. It really it spreads like nothing I've ever seen.
Yeah.
Interesting side note, it's also edible and has a number of medicinal purposes, including treating all sorts of central nervous system disorder and inflammatory problems like Lyme disease. But you know, imagine if we were to start designing with it to like break up asphalt, right? Like in abandoned parking lots in urban areas, and like what could those forests of knotweed become? I think those are really interesting, complicated questions, but they lead us to a state of interdependency on our immediate ecological systems.
Yeah, I would say even that interdependency beckons mutual respect for one's agency, including what Japanese knotweed wants, where it wants to thrive. And I hear what you're saying, Victoria, about how it might rapidly populate or rapidly show up. And I think in the ways that we may not recognize, it is trying to say, look, you have too many heat islands here in the city, and it's time for you to sort of, you know, buckle the surface a bit. You know, and maybe another parable that I would love to elaborate on, but I'll tell you the short version is that we had the opportunity to work in Cleveland along the Cuyahoga River, which, as you know, gave birth to the Clean Water Act, and after it had burned several days in a row back in the 70s, and we took a tour of it by kayak, I believe, as well as by other means, and we happened to. I don't think we would have ever come across this spot on the river had we not decided to become multimodal, which is, I think, also a way of seeking the agency of things. But we came upon this bend that revealed what used to be a concrete plant. And it was very productive at some point and had closed. And it was two seagulls. It was like there was a rookery, and to seagulls, it was like a rocky outcropping that was a perfect habitat for them. And this rookery actually, you know, is going to be one of these, like, you know, soon to be conservation efforts to keep the seagulls there, probably, and keep everything that constitutes its habitat there too. But I think maybe what I'm trying to get at is that the temporality here, it's not just that, you know, things change in state, but what are we willing to use as time, you know, as our scales of time? long as we decide to sort of take on what an urban landscape is. So like the immediacy, the measurability, you know, all of these things are really impeding us from discovering those things. And so I think, you know, I work at a smaller scale now, but I taught urban design for many years, and you realize that the moment you start to try and find the boundary to something is the moment you've limited what the possibilities are. I had the opportunity to work with the folks who constructed a model called patch dynamics, and I'm not sure if that's something familiar, but you know, a beautiful model for how we understand dynamic bounded systems and how they change over time, and how we can even start to visualize them, gets closer. You know, it's not a complete means to help us Western humans try to visualize these complex complex concepts, but even just the means to visualize this is, I think, maybe the first order of business before we, like, how do we sort of put on Martian glasses is really how, you know, what I would be advocating for, so that we can slip away from the paradigms that suck us back in. So that would be my vote.
Sorry to interrupt, but we have a hard deadline at 6 and we're done with our hour. And thank you so much, everyone, for participating. I could talk about weeds for hours and hours. That's been like one of my passion projects for the past couple of months. But yeah, that's going to have to be for another time. So thank you so much, everyone, for participating. This was a wonderful discussion. I learned so much. But yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank
you, everyone.
Great to chat with everybody. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I really did learn a lot.
Same here.
I hope it's the beginning of a longer discussion and